Welcome to the hidden corners where truth and terror collide. Discover a realm where the lines between the living and the supernatural blur as you embark on a journey to the paranormal and visit the mysterious hidden corners of your mind.
Well, this is part 16 of the Wolfman Series. Running with the Werewolves. Siberia. In his red ski coat with wolf fur trim, Vladimir Putin looked like a movie star, flanked by fans as he walked down the corridor to the laboratory. The look on his face spoke otherwise. He was here on a mission. To view the soldiers that could transform into wolves and back again. He hesitated using the term werewolf, knowing that the man he hated, Adolf Hitler, had used that term for his elite band of soldiers. Putin hated everything that reeked of Nazism. He preferred calling them wolf soldiers. Dr. Luther couldn't mask the look of surprise when the men burst through the door of the laboratory. He was not a particularly good liar even in the best of circumstances. Fortunately for him, the 7 men who entered the laboratory thought it was merely shock at seeing the president of Russia walk into the room that left the scientists speechless and flustered. They were not aware of the missing werewolves or the events that had taken place that morning. Only minutes before their arrival, Luther had entered the laboratory only to find that his 3 test subjects, Catherine, Rebecca, and Spencer, were missing. He assumed that it had something to do with his new lab assistant, but not even this was confirmed yet. He hadn't had time to alert authorities or investigate himself. He hadn't even thought of what might be captured on the surveillance cameras. He was still trying to wrap his head around the disappearance when the men entered the room. Dr. Luther, let me introduce you to President Vladimir Putin. Mr. President, this is the scientist who created the serum. Formalities and introductions aside, the men strode toward the 2 soldiers who lay asleep in one of the large room-sized cages. The 2 men lay on a cot, snoring peacefully. Dr. Luther quickly explained that they had only begun the blood transfusions, and as of yet, they were not able to fully transform into wolves. 1 more day of the serum, and they would be ready for the transformation. Then take me to the others, demanded the president. Luther stammered, excuses flooding his brain at a rapid pace. I wasn't aware you were coming, Mr. President. My assistant, the wolf trainer, is working with them out in the field. He prefers training at night, and they have not yet returned. Perhaps you can come back another time. We will wait. Putin glanced around the room as if he was looking for chairs in which to sit. But I have no idea when they'll return, and possibly they may train all day. He's making such progress with them. You'll be very pleased, Luther responded quickly. Putin looked deeply into Luther's eyes with a look that seemed to absorb all the doctor's soul and knowledge. It was a look that said, "Don't lie to me." The men turned as if to leave. We will return tomorrow. I expect them to be here. The door of the laboratory shut behind them. Luther took a deep breath and felt his heart pounding in his chest. He looked down at his arm, and for the first time in his long career, he considered injecting himself with the serum. It might be the only way to protect myself from what's to come. He muttered to himself out loud. The thought scared him. It was okay to experiment on others, but he had never considered experimenting on himself. He drew a vial of serum out of the refrigerated cabinets and filled a syringe. He took a deep breath and injected the full 3-day amount into his arm. A wave of dizziness swept over him. He dropped the syringe and he turned to go to his room, but only made it halfway to the door before collapsing on the floor in an unconscious seizure. Jack and Sasha arrived at the designated drop-off location. An associate of Sasha's would be waiting for Jack at midnight at the hidden door built into the rock wall. The same door that Usko, Catherine, Rebecca, and Spencer had used to escape the underground laboratory. Word had not gotten out yet about the disappearance. Luther had concocted his story on the spur of the moment, and he didn't want to be caught in a lie. The 2 night guards manning the security cameras had slept off their drunkenness and didn't want anyone to know they'd gone on a binge with that bottle of vodka. They hadn't bothered checking the security footage, and they didn't notice the lapse in the timestamp. They had already changed the tapes over to the current date and had left when the next shift arrived. The only other staff that had access to the top secret laboratory besides Luther was his 2 assistants. One was on leave and the other was missing. No one else had authority to enter the room without Dr. Luther's approval, with the exception of his supervisors who had been there in the morning with the president. So no one had questioned the empty cages. Jack gave Sasha a kiss and hiked off into the trees. He would wait until she was out of sight before going through the transformation process. He would put his clothing into his pack along with the guns and the ammunition he was carrying and make sure it was strapped onto his back before assuming his wolf form. He had never attempted to carry a pack before, and he was unsure if he'd be able to do it. And if not, he was prepared to carry the pack with his teeth. And he hoped that wouldn't be necessary. Sasha would be waiting in this same location tomorrow, and if all went as planned, she would pick Jack and his sister up in her car. She couldn't risk being seen near the facility. That'd be a fatal mistake in her position. She planned to help Jack get his sister, find out what she could about the project, and assist he and his sister in leaving the country. She knew she was risking a lot, but there were too many things about this project that she just couldn't stand behind. Usko and his companions traveled by sledge through the forests for most of the following day. They were hungry and tired by the time they reached his cousin's small village where they would stay for the night. Catherine was too weak to walk, so Usko carried her into his cousin's house, with Rebecca following. Rebecca had no problem transforming back into her human form now that she was away from the laboratory. It felt good to be back in her normal body once again. Spencer, however, was still having trouble. It took some convincing for Usko's cousin to allow that enormous wolf into his home. Usko's cousin, Utan, had a wife and 2 little girls, 5 and 3-year-old. The littlest one hid behind her mother's skirts, staring at the strangers. But the little 5-year-old ran up to Spencer and buried her head in his fur, wrapping her little arms around his massive head. He laid down on the floor and gently nuzzled the little girl's hand. Utan's wife poured everyone a cup of hot buttered tea and started preparing a meal. She attempted to convince Usko that Catherine may not survive another day on the sledge. It was decided that they should stay at least a day, maybe 2, at their home before moving on. Utan agreed to rent a car for Usko so they could drive the 1,500 miles to the far shores of the Arctic Sea, where they would meet up with Usko's people and their reindeer herd. There they would be safe in the protection of the tribe as they moved across the frozen tundra to the grasslands and on to the Mongolian steppes. Rebecca and Spencer slept on mats on Utan's floor. Warm and cozy and happy, they were free from the confines of their cages. Catherine slept in the guest bed while Usko dozed in the chair nearby, keeping a watchful eye on her. Now Jack ran through the forest, breaking through thick snow with his body. It was tiring work, but he was driven by the desire to reach his sister. Memories of his vision he had seen during the peyote ceremony in the Tarahumara village had haunted him, and he felt a sort of deja vu, remembering the time he had run through the snow, rushing to rescue his sister from the man they now knew was Julian, her father. Well, that was back in Telluride and seemed ages ago. It felt like years had transpired since he'd felt the warmth of his wood stove at his ranch in Montana. Would he ever see home again? He couldn't let his mind wander. He needed to stay focused. He thought about the process of transformation. How strange it was that he still had thoughts, emotions, and fears as a man would, even though he was now in wolf form. How he was essentially a man in a wolf's body. Did it work the other way as well? A wolf in a man's body? A man focused solely on killing his prey? Is this the reason there were serial killers in the world? Jack realized his mind was wandering again. There was only one thing that mattered now: rescuing Catherine. The snow was deep and Jack was feeling exhausted, but he could see the rock outcropping where the hidden door would be located, not too far ahead. The map Sasha had shown him was clearly marked. He would need to stay hidden in the trees until midnight, when someone would be waiting on the other side of the door to let him in. He planned to get as close as he could and then burrow down into the snow, using his fur coat to keep him warm, hiding in the bushes outside the door. The surveillance cameras would be scanning the area for men, not for wolves. Then, just before midnight, he would transform back into a man, put on his clothes right before knocking at the door. Luther didn't know how long he had been laying on the floor, but when he tried to stand, another wave of dizziness swept over him. He saw the hypodermic needle laying a few feet away and remembered what had transpired. He attempted to crawl towards it. The soldiers had awakened some time before and were hollering in their locked cages for someone to come and let them out. Luther assumed that they were what had finally caused him to wake up. They needed to be fed, given another dosage and then more sedative. He wasn't sure he could do it. The pain and the dizziness coursing through his body was immense. While crawling on all fours, he managed to get to the gurney where Catherine had last been seen. He pulled himself up to a standing position and braced against the gurney for a few minutes. He needed to tend to the soldiers before someone heard them yelling and came to investigate. He felt sick. Somehow he needed to straighten out this mess he was in. He stumbled over to the locked cabinet where the serum was kept and managed to get 2 hypodermic syringes ready for the soldiers in their cages. First, they would need to have their meal. The laboratory doors were kept locked and no one was allowed inside. Normally, Dr. Luther would have his assistants walk down to the cafeteria and get the food trays for the soldiers and the 3 captive prisoners that were now missing. But the assistant was gone. Dr. Luther would have to manage to get the food trays himself. He took a deep breath and tried to quell the dizziness that rushed through his body. He could do this. He had to. He glanced at his watch and he saw that it was nearly 6 p.m. It had been hours since he had injected the serum into his arm that would transform him into a werewolf. Luther could feel the first ripples of transformation coursing through his veins. He gathered his strength and walked through the laboratory door. The cafeteria buzzed with the low hum of conversations and the clinking of cutlery against the plates. Luther noticed his hearing was sharpened and he was able to pick up threads of conversation that he normally would never have been able to hear. His heightened senses picked up every subtle gasp and whisper of breath. Determined to keep a low profile, he headed towards the counter, keeping his movements purposeful and controlled. The scent of freshly prepared food caught his attention, and he could smell meat. Hunger gripped his stomach, and he felt himself drooling. He realized that with each passing moment, the boundaries between man and wolf blurred. He felt a craving for blood. He realized the attendant was asking him what he needed, and he jerked his head toward her. The clock on the wall was ticking loudly, mingling with the sound of voices, the whisper of breaths, the clinking of glasses and dishes, and it all rushed at him at once. He wanted to run from the noise, the clamor growing ever steadily. He couldn't control the jerking movements. He needed to get out of there fast. Just put 6 trays of food on the cart. The attendant reacted swiftly to the crazed look in Luther's eyes. A cart was rolled out with 6 covered trays of food, and Luther quickly rolled the cart from the cafeteria down the corridor towards the laboratory. Noticing the hair on the back of his hands and feeling the flexing of his spine, he quickly locked the laboratory door and took 2 trays of food to each of the 2 soldiers in the room-sized cages, along with their final injection of serum and sedative, and relocked the cages. He was deeply bent over by now and could feel the expansion of his chest and thigh muscles. He was so hungry. He tried to remove the covering from a tray of food and dumped it on the floor in his haste. He leaned down to eat the spilled stroganoff and licked the floor clean with his long tongue. Jack arrived at the base of the rock wall that held the hidden entrance to the underground bunker. He had a couple of hours to wait. He lay under the branches of a fir tree, sheltered from the falling snow, and dug a small hole to lay in, rolling into a tight ball of fur to keep himself warm while he waited. The anticipation of what lay ahead kept Jack from falling into a deep sleep, but he allowed himself to rest while remaining alert to any sound or subtle change in his environment. The hours ticked by, and finally the watch that he had strapped to his pack read 5 minutes till midnight. He quickly shook the snow off his fur and began the painful transformation back into his human form. Naked, he realized how incredibly cold it was. He quickly put on his clothes, his coats, his boot, and waited by the door, shivering uncontrollably. At precisely midnight, the door opened just a crack. "Werewolf," Jack uttered in a trembling, frozen voice. The door opened and Jack rushed in. Overwhelmed by the sudden blast of warm air, the man who had just opened the door held his fingers to his lips, indicating silence, and Jack reached down with shaking hands to remove the boots. They would walk through the tunnel in their socks. The man led the way through the dark tunnel. The cameras and the lights had been blocked with heavy black cloths so they could pass through the tunnel unseen. The surveillance crew would think there was a power outage in this part of the building and leave it for the next shift to attend to. It just so happened that the man who was helping Jack through the tunnel was the man they would conveniently call to fix the power outage. He was the maintenance electrician, a man named Alex, who was responsible for fixing little technical issues like this. At the end of the tunnel, Alex pushed buttons on the panel beside the door and it slid open, revealing a long corridor. They quickly made their way to the laboratory and Alex opened the door with a key. They entered the laboratory and locked the door behind them. The lights were dim and Jack could see a gurney in the middle of the room. He realized this room was nearly identical to the one he had seen in his vision, and he expected to see Catherine lying there on the gurney, but it was empty. The 2 men rushed across the room to where they saw the cages. 2 were empty, but looked as if they had recently had occupants. There were bowls of water and blankets and chains attached to the cages, but 2 of the cages had men sleeping soundly on cots. "What the hell? Where is my sister?" Jack whispered. They heard a low growl from the dark corner of the room, and 2 glowing red eyes stared out at them from the blackness. Jack instinctively pushed the other man behind him while he faced off with the wolf who was now slowly coming at him. "Back away, slowly, towards the door," he whispered to Alex. He quickly removed his coat and began unbuttoning his shirt, never taking his eyes off the snarling wolf in front of him. The man did as he was told, retreating to the other side of the laboratory, standing near the locked laboratory door. Jack was transforming right in front of his eyes. He gasped, watching as Jack became a wolf. In the dim light of the laboratory, the 2 werewolves confronted each other, snarling and growling. The clatter and clicking of claws against the cold floor echoed like a macabre percussion as the 2 wolves began circling each other, casting long shadows against the sterile walls of the laboratory. With a fierce snarl, the smaller wolf lunged forward, swiping his claws at the larger one. But with agility and grace, the larger of the two countered with a swift sidestep, avoiding the oncoming assault, and with a terrific howl, it leaped at the smaller wolf and sank his teeth into the neck of his adversary. Blood spewed forth. The smaller wolf struggled to gain footing, but the larger wolf had it pinned and locked its jaws into the skin of the neck muscles. Unconscious at last, the smaller wolf shuddered and then lay still. Not wanting to kill, the larger wolf released his grip and relaxed his jaw. In a normal fight, he would have ripped out the throat of his opponent. As the large wolf stepped back, the smaller wolf slowly transformed back into his human form. Lying there, naked on the floor, was Dr. Luther. Jack held a gauze compress to Luther's neck to stop the bleeding. Gaining consciousness, Luther lay whimpering on the floor. Jack threw a lab coat at him and told him to get dressed. "Where is she?" Jack demanded. Luther sat on the floor holding the compress to his neck. "I don't know. They disappeared last night, all three of them. My assistant must have taken them. He is a wolf trainer. He was supposed to be here to train the soldiers." Luther nodded his head toward the sleeping men on the two cots. "Honestly, I don't know where they are, and my life is over tomorrow if I can't produce them. Putin is here, in this facility. He wants to see proof of the serum's ability to transform his soldiers into wolves. I've got these two soldiers here, but their blood hasn't completely accepted the transfusion yet. I need to show him proof of the serum's ability to transform. I need to show him Rebecca and Spencer." "Wait a minute, who is Spencer, and what have you done to Catherine? Did you give her the serum?" asked Jack. "Spencer is Rebecca's brother. You know who Rebecca is, and Catherine has not shown any ability to transform." Jack sighed. "Tell me who this assistant is that took Catherine. How do I find him?" "I don't know, Jack. I just found out this morning. I have to produce proof of the serum to Putin tomorrow, so I injected it into myself. I thought if I could transform, I could show him that it works. Buy myself some time. Try to figure out how to find them. All of them." Jack looked up at Alex. "Is there anything you can find out for us? Are you able to get a message to Sasha or to her brother? See if anyone can find out who this assistant is and where he might have gone?" The man nodded his head and said, "Yes, I'll speak to them. We'll see what we can find out, but we need to get you out of here." "Don't leave me here," Luther exclaimed. "They'll kill me." "I really don't care what they do to you," Jack replied, "but we may need you as leverage. What do you think, Alex? Should we take him along?" "Let's go," Alex replied. "Now!" Escaping through a dark hallway toward the hidden passage, Alex led the two men away from the laboratory. It was bitter cold outside, and Jack didn't know if Luther had enough strength to survive the trek back to the location where Sasha would meet them. But if they had to leave him here to die in the snow, so be it. He owed this man no favors. He was lucky he was still alive. Jack's anger fueled his strength. Luther's fear fueled his own. The two men raced off in their wolf forms across the snow towards the trees which would hide them from the cameras. By the next morning, Catherine was gaining her strength back. Slowly, she was able to sit up by herself and sip the broth that Utan's wife had prepared for her. It was full of healing herbs that would help build her blood cells that had been taken. "You need to stay an extra day," she told Usko. He disagreed. "It's not safe. We need to get farther away. I'll get a car today and we'll leave in the morning. I appreciate everything you've done for us, and I really appreciate a couple jars of your soup to take along and maybe some sandwiches for the rest of us. I'll pay you." "You are family, Usko. We take care of our own. You know that," she said. Usko entered the living room and found Rebecca sitting on the sofa watching TV, and Spencer curled up on the floor with ribbons tied to his fur and his tail. He looked up with big puppy dog eyes that seemed to smile. The two little girls were brushing his matted fur and weaving multicolored ribbons throughout the locks. Utan laughed. "I think you need to leave this one here. The girls just love him." Sasha returned to the hotel she and Jack had spent the previous night at. She opened up her laptop and checked her emails. Then she phoned her brother. "Everything is going just as planned. I dropped Jack off where you told me. Peter replied, I just received a phone call from Alex. Obviously, you haven't heard yet. Jack's sister, Catherine, along with the other 2 Americans, are missing. Alex thinks they were kidnapped by the wolf trainer. We don't know where he's taken them or who he is working for. We're running a background check on him right now. He's from Mongolia, but he has spent much of his time up in the Arctic. That's all we know for sure, but that's not all. The doctor fled with Jack. Putin is here. He wants to see the wolves for himself. It's a mess, Sasha. What have you gotten yourself into? There was a silence on the phone line. Finally, Sasha spoke. We stick to the plan. I'll pick up Jack just like I told him I would. If this doctor is with him, he'll come with me. Find out everything you can about the wolf trainer. We need to find that girl. I won't risk losing everything I've worked for on this mistake. Let me handle the boss. I'll tell him something. But we need that girl alive. There's a lot of money riding on this.